When you think about it, this generation's overall quality control has been severely lacking. More than any past console cycle, the 8th generation literally started with bugs, visual glitches, and a bevy of problems right out the gate. Things like Watch Dogs being a letdown or The Order 1886 being a glorified cutscene may seem like a distant memory now that we've had The Witcher 3, Breath of the Wild, and God of War, but video games creaking under the visions of their developers was commonplace from day one. It's kind of the reason why we got half-step systems like the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X released with developers in mind to finally allow for final products that weren't falling apart at the seams. Still, even with greater horsepower available, scores of publishers or money-hungry developers kick projects out the door knowing that patches or touch-ups will make them playable somewhere down the line. Technical inefficiency is just one of the many ways video games can be genuinely broken or unfinished though, and from design goals to miscommunication, sometimes it can all just fall apart. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 totally broken parts of video games we somehow put up with. Number 10, a boss fight against time? Quantum Break. What's the weirdest boss battle? Fighting a moon in Dead Space 3? Cobweb crotch grandma from Resident Evil 7? A chainsaw-wielding baby from Catherine? How about light itself? Well, light and time. Yes, the plot of Quantum Break involves time itself coming to a halt, and the ensuing apocalypse of darkness and demons that involves. Evildoer Paul Serene, played by Littlefinger himself Aidan Gillen, manages to weaponize this version of time, now turning it into force pushes and physics manipulation, setting about trying to kill you with it. Look, to be honest, none of the time powers made any sense in Quantum Break, and come the final fight where Jack Joyce and Paul Serene have a time fight, it was a big old mess. However, all of that is conceptual. The real problem came with time being visualized as an encroaching light source. Serene would power up, and if you were standing in just the wrong spot despite it being invisible, that was it. Instant game over. No feedback, no idea of where you went wrong, just the realization that a combination of light and time had killed you. Terrible. Number 9, the skyscraper server crash, Battlefield 4. 2013 was a bad year for video games and the video game industry, at least when it came to bug control. After investing a lot of planning into PC hardware and PC gaming, scores of developers were caught short when, hey, it turns out that people do still want to play consoles. This would lead to the rollout of half-baked games across 2014, but Battlefield 4 also released on both previous and the newer generation simultaneously, suffering immensely in the transition. One particular map, the multiplayer showpiece Siege of Shanghai, was set to demonstrate EA's new buzzword for the time, Levolution, a term given to how environments would change as players fought amongst them. The only problem? Trying to get Battlefield 4 to sync its Shanghai tower collapsing at the same time across all connected players would tank the server and sever all connections. Every single time. This, though, was the tip of the iceberg. EA created a website for players to log issues, only for the post-launch patch period to go on for so long that DICE were forced to abandon it in favor of Star Wars Battlefront. EA would later label the handling of all of this as unacceptable, only to repeat this mistake multiple times across the rest of the generation. Number 8, the bounty and wanted system, Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead 2 is arguably the most impressive of everything released across the PS4 and Xbox One. It is not without its faults though, and while you can have an incredibly immersive time as Arthur Morgan, shooting up saloons, skinning animals for food, and all-round living in virtual reality without the goggles, the game's wanted system drew criticism for good reason. Assumedly coded as a way to keep tabs on players no matter what, even if you make sure no one is around, like you're up in the mountains with just a mouse's fart for company, firing guns or killing someone will always put a bounty on your head. It's not just proximity either. Items like face-covering masks wouldn't hide your identity, and even if you took out a number of enemies with silenced weapons like knives or stealth takedowns, you'd still have the law breathing down your neck in seconds. To this day, there is no definitive way to avoid a bounty in Red Dead Redemption 2, and it's testament to how stellar the rest of the game came together that we couldn't care less. Number 7, all those interrogations, L.A. Noire. As a game that suffered development hell thanks to Team Bondi boss Brendan McNamara reportedly enforcing horrific work practices and treating employees as disposable drones, L.A. Noire still became a recommendable crime thriller, but its core mechanics suffered. One of the most obvious was the game's interrogations, which saw main character Cole Phelps fly off the handle at even the calmest of lead-in sentences, only to resume his candor next time around, then freak out again. The reason was entirely rooted in such a scattershot development, as McNamara revealed to Eurogamer that Phelps actor Aaron Staton recorded the dialogue options as coax, force, and lie, only for this to change after recording to truth, doubt, or lie. As you can imagine, there's a wealth of difference between actively forcing a suspect to say something and just being doubtful, resulting in such a massive mix-up. The game's 2017 re-release attempted to change this once again to good cop, bad cop, and accused, but these two were way too vague, and LA Noir's interrogations remained, for want of a better word, totally broken. Thankfully, it didn't stop an entire fandom declaring it one of Rockstar's best. Number 6. Mortal Kombat 2011's netcode. If there's one thing you need for a functioning multiplayer fighting game, it's a functioning multiplayer mode. Sounds obvious, sounds like the first thing you'd perfect before rolling out any build to the public, but this was a time before widespread public betas and testing. For Mortal Kombat 9, a soft reboot of the franchise, being the first from NetherRealm since being acquired by Warner Bros., this would be the first major Mortal Kombat on PS3 and Xbox 360 hardware. All fans had beforehand was MK vs DC, and all eyes were on MK9 to knock it out the park, in an age where online play was increasingly popular. Sadly, this rebooted Mortal Kombat 9's online components were completely busted. To this day, NetherRealm never managed to get its netcode stable, and although King of the Hill, Winner Stays On style modes were a genius innovation, they just weren't accessible or fun to interact with. On the flip side though, MK9 debuted a revolutionary approach to storytelling in fighting games that's still being used across the genre today. Its combat was exemplary and the roster nigh on perfect, which at least softened the blow a little bit. Number 5. Finding dead bodies no matter what. Splinter Cell Pandora Tomorrow. Splinter Cell remains a supremely recommendable stealth series, but if you're gonna go in without the nostalgia goggles, you should probably stick to third installment Chaos Theory. Why? Because although Pandora Tomorrow contains a phenomenal train infiltration and an iconic level where you sneak through a marijuana field, its stealth mechanics are totally broken. Born out of the idea that Ubisoft wanted a way for guards to actively look for bodies or scan the area in general, they coded a series of invisible scan points, where the game checks to see where you left unconscious guards and automatically penalizes you if they weren't fully in shadow. Understandably, this didn't take into account stashing people behind back alleys, underwater, or in any number of places where no one would actually look, and it always resulted in you getting an immediate strike. 3 strikes and you were back to the beginning of the whole level. Even worse was the fact that these scan points doubled as autosaves and checkpoints, dooming you to a cycle of reloading and stepping forward, only for a body from 20 minutes ago to send you back to the same restart screen again. Number 4. Horrifically implemented stealth. Final Fantasy 15. Hands down, this is the worst chunk of game I've ever played. A full chapter of a game so unfinished, so broken and ill-conceived, it resulted in being completely gutted and replaced some months after release. Back to what was initially in the game though, as Final Fantasy XV's 13th chapter went down in history for all the wrong reasons. Besides terrible level design that forces you to take the long way around waist-high walls and a terrible plot revelation involving Prompto being a robot, there's over an hour of being near weaponless, avoiding invisible enemy vision fields as contextual prompts tell you when to hide. I cannot stress how terrible this was to play, to feel how much it didn't belong in an otherwise fairly solid Final Fantasy. This section's placement in the game's final act completely killed the pacing, was clearly something that shouldn't have been greenlit in the first place, and post-patch is only remembered by the creators and those unlucky enough to have experienced it. Number 3. The Anchor's boss fight method. Control. Control is an exemplary game when it comes to world building and especially combat. For the latter, it damn near feels like playing as a souped-up Jean Grey, lobbing everything from forklift trucks to office equipment at whatever's in your way. For the former, well, despite not really knowing how to end, a large part of Control's world involves supernatural energy being associated with everyday objects. As the game plays out, this is how optional boss battles are handled, and from fridges to mirrors, it's over to you to tackle them whenever you like. Only one of them, called the Anchor, has a specific method that you can totally miss by deploying it too early. This boss is practically a giant metal Pac-Man, and you defeat it by standing on platforms and lobbing discarded clocks into its mouth. Because video games. Start the fight by doing this before it's fired its first shot though, and nothing happens. You can continue the fight, as I did, wondering just how the hell to even damage this thing, when the solution was actually right in front of you the whole time. Number 2. Terrible matchmaking. Halo the Master Chief Collection. It took 4 years. 4 long years for Halo the Master Chief Collection to finally become reliably playable. Such was the reality of a broken product being released in 2014, only for so many patches and tweaks to be applied that it crossed over into Halo 5 development, as priorities changed and the collection itself was left behind. In those 4 years though, it's not like fans weren't going to play the games, because the original Halos are still some of the best sci-fi shooters in gaming history. Instead, it just meant that we were stuck searching for games for literal minutes at a time, suffering endless disconnects, incorrect statistics on active player numbers, and everything in between. Actually getting into a game was pot luck, and half the people waiting would have likely given up. This really was unacceptable, and represented one of the many mistakes that got this generation off to a terrible start. And number 1, everything. Superman 64. Widely regarded as one of the worst games of all time if we're going to talk about titles rife with broken elements that kids and teenagers put up with because, well, to be honest, it's still Superman, look no further than Superman 64. An utter turd of an experience, actually controlling Superman was hopeless as he had a mind of his own. But more fascinatingly was the reality of the game's development, where creative opportunities were quashed at every turn. According to the game's producer Eric Kane when speaking to ProtonJohn.com, DC were apparently impossible to deal with, forcing Titus Interactive to remove the vast majority of the ideas they had for the full game. The whole idea of a virtual world rather than actual Metropolis was because they didn't like the idea of Kal-El kicking real people. And after an initial shipping date was missed by 6 months due to constant infighting, Kane noted that Superman 64 was, and I quote, not even 10% of what we intended to do. Also saying that, and I quote again, the licensor killed us. Superman 64 was so reviled and laughed at that a 75% complete PS1 version was cancelled altogether. And that is just a selection of some totally broken video games with a whole bunch of components that we just had to put up with. Let me know your own examples down in the comments below, and please check out the WhatCulture Gaming Podcast. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com, and I'll catch you soon.